Tango Games is an underrated studio who makes underrated games. I have been a big fan since they started. The original Evil Within is a game that I enjoy to go back to. It has a great atmosphere and a creepy visual style, along with fun Resident Evil 4 inspired combat. The story is really interesting as well, though it can be convolutedly told, making it more complicated than it really needs to be. The sequel was one of those rare follow-ups that managed to be better than the first. It was a nice mix of large and more linear levels that are mixed in with the exploration, stealth, and tense action. The story this time around lacks some of the creepy style from the first, but instead we got a narrative that I found myself getting more emotionally invested in than in the original. Sebastian was a beaten down character who had this opportunity to sort of redeem himself by saving his family. Both the story and the gameplay intertwine to make one of my favorite games of that generation, and if you haven't played either, I highly recommend both. Now, The Evil Within 2 provides a good amount of satisfying closure to the story, while leaving some things left open for a potential third entry. So while Evil Within 2 did not sell the best, I thought it would probably be a while till we ever saw a third one. Oddly enough, Tango was making a new game, but instead of another sequel in this series, it was going to be a brand new IP. I wasn't completely sold at first, and while I really enjoy first-person shooters, I honestly prefer the third-person setup to their prior games. This was one of those situations where I really couldn't get a good read on the game from the trailers, but the studio built up enough credit with their prior work that I wanted to give it a try. Now, I will say this as well, we are in the third year of the next generation consoles, and there's really only a handful of games that are exclusive to the PS5, and I'm not counting the cross-generation games. Outside of Returnal, Ghostwire was one of the few that I was interested in. When I got the opportunity to dive in, I found a lot to enjoy. So much so, I felt like while Ghostwire does have its fair share of issues, it's also underrated and deserves more attention than it ever received at launch. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you my review for Ghostwire Tokyo. Ghostwire does a good job of providing an interesting story with some memorable characters, along with an ending that provides satisfying closure to the whole journey. On the gameplay side of things, I very much enjoy the interesting combat system. On the surface, it looks like a first-person shooter, and in many respects it is, but it operates differently with the minute-to-minute action. Exploration is pretty fun as well, as you can grapple to rooftops and use a glide to move around to grab useful items from up high. The open world has a familiar setup of other open world games, but Ghostwire's strong story and captivating visual style is what helps to set it apart. I do think that Ghostwire could have benefited from a smaller, more denser space to explore, but overall, it's a very fun game.
We gotta help!
Now let's start off with the gameplay. You have a few means of attacks and weapons to use in combat. You have access to 3 different types of energy blasts that you can launch from your hands. You start off with wind, which is your main go-to, and then you earn water, which provides wide attacks, and fire, which is an area of effect bomb-like blast. Each one is very useful for different situations. Both the sound effects and impact are satisfying. Your blast will leave holes in enemies, and they will grow as you hit them more. Along with some of your attacks, you can cause enemies to trip, fall over, or be thrown back. On top of this, you have a bow, which can be charged up for stronger attacks, along with some throwables, like ones that stun, damage, or even distract enemies. For defense, you can block most attacks, and if you get your timing right, you can parry those attacks as well. The combat here feels slower than a normal first-person shooter, more calculated and even a little more clunky. You cannot just aimlessly blast away at your enemies. You need to time your shots well and not waste them. After the first few hours, I found myself in situations where I really needed to consider when I fired, to not be in a position where I was out of energy. As you make holes in enemies, their cores will be exposed and you can rip them out. You can rip several out at once if many enemies are exposed, and this gives you some health back. Stealth is another option, but this is not a stealth game. This is more of a light stealth system that if you want to use it to thin the herd a bit. Now with this being an open world game, there is a large area to explore. What made Ghostwire generally fun to explore was how you have two planes to be in. Essentially, there's stuff to grab on the ground and on the rooftops. Shortly after the first few hours, you'll be able to grapple and glide, which never gets old. Side stuff ranges from finding money, defeating enemy outposts, finding spirits, rescuing spirits, clearing infected areas, and more. It is all the expected stuff and all ranges from decent to good. The side missions, I think, are the real stars of the side content. They can be rather simple with a minimal story or a larger focus on combat, or others can be a bit longer and feel more in-depth, like supernatural investigations. Some of these missions surprised me, and I enjoyed when more of the involved ones popped up. One I really liked was in the subway with a lot of creepy imagery. Progression-wise, you will earn experience points from defeating enemies and completing missions. As you level up, your health will increase and you will earn skill points that you can choose to upgrade what you want, like being able to glide longer, earn health from ripped out cores, creating your own grapple shots, and a lot more. On top of this, you will find beads that provide you with buffs for your character, and this gives you some light customization depending on which ones you have equipped. Story-wise, I really enjoyed this from beginning to the end. It mainly centers around two characters, Akido and his spirit, KK. By KK inhabiting his body, Akido has powers. One of the strongest elements to the narrative is their dynamic. They need to work together to achieve both of their goals. There's struggles and conflicts that they need to overcome, and I really like some of the dialogue that you get in the side missions, as there's some appreciated humor there between the two of them. Presentation-wise, the story missions and some of the side missions are full of horror-like supernatural imagery. The game isn't really scary, just uneasy at times and enjoyably unique with its visual approach. I really like both of the main characters, especially KK, and like I said before, the story is solid and one that is worth taking and provides a satisfying conclusion. There's even some fun, enjoyable, cheesy moments as well. Now the story is one of the best parts of the game, and I enjoyed the gameplay, but Ghostwire does have its fair share of flaws as well. One of the biggest ones I had right away was with the aiming and camera movement. The sensitivity felt really off, to the point that this default setting was not good at all. Thankfully, the Ghostwire subreddit provided some appreciated options to tweak the controls better. So if you do not like the default controls, go to the subreddit and find some options to try. I do find it odd that you would think that this game was playtested, and these camera controls are objectively not the best. So why would you make this default for everyone? This seems like it could have been done a lot better. I did have an issue with one of the bosses that felt tedious and dragged out. You need to essentially perform stealth takedowns on it. You can hit them with some explosives to make the fight go a bit quicker, but I felt like this was one of those situations where the whole thing could have been more exciting. Generally, I found the boss fights to be fun distractions and follow a traditional formula of needing to hit the weak points. Now my next comment may be more of a preference thing, but I think Ghostwire Tokyo could have benefited from being smaller, but a more dense open world. I was impressed by how big it got, but it also made the open world stuff feel tedious in the second half of the game. Potentially, I think if we had seen a strip of a smaller section of Tokyo where we could explore each building and really get to know those areas more, this could have worked a bit better. And lastly, I had visual issues with this game at first since my TV had issues with the game itself. Apparently it is a known issue, and this is really annoying to have it happen at the start of the game. Again, thanks to the Ghostwire subreddit for providing those fixes. Ghostwire does have some flaws, but like I mentioned, it has plenty of good and it's really fun. Ghostwire Tokyo is one of 2022's underrated games. Just like a good amount of underrated games this year, it felt like this came out and was quickly forgotten about, which sucks considering how the studio continually brings it with each game they have made so far. Biasly, I would have preferred them make an Evil Within 3, but after playing Ghostwire, I'm glad they made this. The biggest reason is that it showed that Tango is not a one-trick pony, and that they could make something completely different, and it expands their wheelhouse more. The combat is a bit different and pretty fun. The exploration is enjoyable as well with the vertical aspect to it. I just wish that the area was more dense and not as big as it was in the game. Story-wise, this is one of the strongest areas in the game, and the dynamic between our two heroes keeps us invested. Ghostwire has some rough spots, but overall I recommend checking this one out. If you're interested in being notified of new videos, please hit the subscribe button and bell. And if you would like to support the channel and get early access to content, please check out my Patreon. All of the links will be at the end of this video and within the description, and thank you very much for watching.